The sheer brutality of these murders earmarked them as something different.
We couldn't believe that the injuries could have been done by somebody of sane mind.
They weren't satisfied with killing them. They had to torture them.
And somewhere in this country at the moment there is a serial murder being reenacted.
In 1983, the neatly butchered remains of 3 young men were discovered blocking the drains of a North London house.
After having a corpse at his disposal, dressing it, undressing it, sitting it in front of the television, giving it a bath, after about 5 days it became unpleasant, and he would then put it under the floorboards.
He would let bodies decompose to a point, and he would then remove the flesh from bones. He dissected this into small pieces. Obviously there was a limit to how much he could actually flush away.
But the gruesome discoveries at Cranley Gardens were just the start. Over a 4-year period, the tenant, Dennis Nilsen, had killed 15 men.
This is a view at Cranley Gardens, looking down the side alley away from the drain cover. This is a view actually looking down the drain, where of course Dynarod first discovered human flesh.
I drove the CID car up to Cranley Gardens, and I was met there by Michael Catron, who was the Dynarod plumber. Mike had pulled some remains of what looked like just pieces of meat. And I was handed, or I selected 3 bones. Each of the bones was about 2 or 3 inches long and had a knuckle at each end, which struck me straight away that these could well have come from a hand, a human hand. So from a bit of a mystery, we suddenly realised we had a definite murder case on our hands.
The only suspect seemed to be the tenant of the top-floor flat. Yet it was Dennis Nilsen who had complained that the drains were blocked.
Nilsen came through the front door looking just like Mr. Ordinary, and as he came in, I said to him light-heartedly, "I've come about your drains." I had decided to adopt that approach with him because it had occurred to me that anyone who chops up a body and flushes it down the loo is going to be a little bit odd, to say the least. A smile came across his face and he said, "You know, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" And I said, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." On entering the flat, I could smell that all too familiar aroma of decomposing flesh, and I said to Nilsen, your drains were blocked with human remains, and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed myself a little closer to him and I said, "Don't mess me about, where's the rest of the body?" And he just said straight away, "It's in 2 plastic bags in the other room."
We were pointed in the direction of a large wardrobe. And as you see there's the 2 large black plastic bags which have got body parts in. Also in next to these wardrobes there was a pile of tea chests which he'd carefully concealed by placing things like a hoover and a heater on the top of them as if they were being carefully stored. So obviously there were more bags with more body parts concealed in there.
I was driving the CID car and Steve McCusker was with Nilsen on the back seat. And I remember Steve suddenly out of the blue saying to Nilsen, "Are we talking about 1 body or 2? And Nilsen said neither. He said it's 16. Well, it later turned out to be 15 after we'd sort of gone into great detail.
Nilsen explained to the police that he had strangled all 15 victims. Then he was faced with the problem of how to get rid of the bodies.
He had a top-floor flat. He didn't drive a car, and he had no means of getting rid of, disposing of the remains of the bodies.
So Nilsen was forced to start the disposal process in his kitchen.
In fact, traces of human fat were found actually on the cooker from the kitchen. So obviously that had to be examined because it was apparent that he'd done things like boil heads, etc.
He said that a body cannot suffer, and it was I think he used a phrase. It's something that he wrote in prison. He said the disposal of the bodies was like the dirty platter after the feast.
And what he was doing for most of the time was cutting up the bodies into 4 or 5 sections, and then removing the flesh, flushing it down the loo, and putting the bones out for the dustmen in black plastic bags.
He must have thought that the sewer system would actually deal with what it was that he was putting down. What he didn't understand were sewage and plumbing dynamics. If he had, he'd still be there.
In all, the police found the remains of 3 bodies at Cranley Gardens. But this was not the only flat Dennis Nilsen had lived in.
He'd had a previous address in Melrose Avenue, Willesden. He had a ground floor flat with a garden, where, in fact, as it turned out, he'd murdered another 12 men. He started off by putting the bodies under the floorboards and hoping that that would be the end of it. But of course, as he killed more and more people, he had less and less room under the floorboards.
He packed them into cardboard boxes, small suitcases, any receptacle really that he could find. And then he would light a large bonfire on waste ground at the back of the garden. And he would have a good old fire about 1 or 2 in the morning.
Nilsen now went out of his way to be helpful to the police. He even offered to return to the scene of his crime to locate the remains of his victims.
He admitted everything. He was very helpful. He was as helpful as he possibly could be, I think. He showed us the floorboards that he'd lifted to conceal the bodies underneath, and he showed us the garden where he'd had these bonfires late at night.
And it was all just so very matter of fact, as if, you know, he was describing a landscape gardening exercise, maybe. It was just very calm.
For him, control, and I don't just mean control of the people he killed at the time, but control of himself within the overall system, of the way he's perceived, of how he interacts with other people, is of great importance to him. It was then, and I think it remains so now.
We found 3 sites of bonfires in that back garden, and what we decided to do was to lift the first 12 inches of soil right across the garden and sieve it to try and find anything that would help us to identify the bodies.
We found very small bones, for instance, bones in the hands and the feet, the component parts of some 8 bodies, which obviously went along the road of confirming his multiple killing that he carried out at Melrose Avenue.
He said that he murdered for the first time in order to stop somebody leaving. It was an Irish boy, met in a pub in Cricklewood. We've tried to track him down, but we've never succeeded. We still don't know who that was. He went home with Nilsen. It was during the night, he said, that he realized this person is going in the morning and I'll be back where I started. And so, he said, I killed him in order to keep him.
It's easy to see how that can be interpreted as a lonely man looking for company. Nilsen wasn't lonely. He isn't lonely. The person who's most important in Nilsen's universe is Nilsen. What he was looking for was their physical presence. Passive, dead. So no, he's not killing for company.
He often referred to the fact that having murdered somebody late at night he would wake up the next morning to find the dead body there and think to himself, oh, here we go again. I think he was tired of that part of it. I don't think he actually enjoyed the killing. I think the killings were just something that happened inexplicably.
Nilsen was a homosexual and met his victims in local gay pubs.
A lot of them worked in the catering trade. Some of them had left home to come to London to seek their fortunes. The only victim that just didn't fit that pattern at all was Kenneth Ockenden.
Ockenden, a Canadian student, met Nilsen in a London pub and was taken back to his flat in Melrose Avenue.
Kenneth Ockenden's murder was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I think it was later on during the evening, at a time when young Kenneth had decided he wanted to leave. I think Nilsen had taken quite a shine to him and was sorry that he was going to leave. That's probably what triggered that murder.
Dennis Nilsen had strangled Kenneth Ockenden and put his body under the floorboards. But at the time of his disappearance, there was nothing to link the two men. In fact, there was nothing to link Nilsen to any of his victims.
There was a certain amount of cunning involved. These were people in bars in central London. He knew that they had nowhere else to go, that they might not have anywhere to sleep, and they would not be missed.
13 of Nilsen's 15 victims were not reported missing. This meant the only clues to their identification came from their murderer.
Much of the information that Nilsen gave to us was very, very limited. One young man he described as having a tattoo around his neck, a dotted line with the words "cut here." That's all he could remember about him. There was another a young man that he could only describe as being Irish. Well, we had absolutely no chance at all with identifying them. Our efforts were therefore concentrated on the ones that we did have some specific information on.
With Nilsen's help, 5 of his victims were identified. Martin Duffy, a 17-year-old catering student, was part strangled, then drowned in the kitchen sink. Nilsen had met 27-year-old Billy Sutherland in Piccadilly Circus. Graham Allen had been invited back to Cranley Gardens, as had Stephen Sinclair, while Malcolm Barlow had literally turned up on his doorstep.
Nilsen took him indoors and cooked him an omelette. Barlow had told him he was on tablets from the hospital, but in spite of that he insisted on having a beer with his omelette. And Nilsen had said to him that it's silly to drink when you're on those tablets. And Barlow said, well, I don't care. And that actually triggered the thought in Nilsen's mind, well, if he doesn't care, I don't either. And that was the end of him.
I opened the newspaper one morning to read of a man who had been arrested and was suspected of dismembering corpses so bizarre that I thought this might deserve some inquiry. I wrote him a letter, and he replied with a very unnerving opening line, which said, "Dear Mr. Masters, I pass the burden of my life onto your shoulders."
Over the next 10 years, Dennis Nilsen would fill 52 exercise books with his life story, giving the experts tantalizing clues to why he had killed so many. Dennis Nilsen grew up in the isolated Scottish fishing port of Fraserburgh.
When he was at school, when he was young, He would play with little boys that were, others wouldn't play with. He was a very caring sort of person.
Years later, while in prison, he wrote an account of the childhood influences he believed drove him to kill. They included the death of his grandfather.
Dennis would have been nearly 5 at that time. He'd seen his granda lying in this box. He was there 1 minute and he was gone the next. And everybody said, but he's gone to a better place. They never actually said he was dead. So he'd been thinking, why he took me everywhere. Why could he not take me to that better place with him?
From then on, Nilsen claimed he became obsessed with death and dead bodies.
It emerged at the Old Bailey hearing that Nilsen had bathed at least one, possibly 2 of the bodies, talcum powdered it and left it lying on his bed at night. He saw his grandfather dead and noticed that he had a pallor and was trying to recreate seeing his grandfather.
Certainly a trauma of a losing a grandfather, a loved individual in a lifetime can have a profound effect on an individual, but how many people who have lost a loved one have reverted to serial homicide? I don't see the connection. I don't see the link. And what I do know is that serial killers will oftentimes point to some event in their life that they use as a basis for to justify the acts that occur later on down the line.
All people were furniture to him, were objects. He didn't know how to relate to any of them. He had no love for life. He had no respect for life. He had no recognition of what life is, really. He said that the murderous impulse, when it occurs, cannot be resisted. It's something I had to do.
This is a man who is a psychopath. This is a man who killed people for pleasure.
They are incapable of establishing an interpersonal relationship, a good interpersonal relationship with another human being, living human being. And therefore they revert to necrophilia, they revert to possession, they revert to killing.
He never directly asked me whether I thought he was mad. But he did ask himself in front of me. He did say, maybe I am mad. Maybe that's the only explanation. But I don't feel mad, so I don't know what it's supposed to feel like. The logical part of him recognized that killing people was a wicked thing to do, that it was wrong, that it was inexcusable, and that he would have to be punished for it.
He said, it amazes me that I have no tears for myself. I have no tears for my victims, or those bereaved by my actions.
Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 6 of his 15 victims. The small amount of remains found meant that even with his descriptions, identification of 8 proved impossible.
I usually solved everything in my family, and that's something I can't solve, because you can't put it back, life. I mean, if you steal, you can put that back. But when you take life, you can never make it right. Now I've got that hurt inside me, and I've got to live with that I can't make it right.
10 years after Nilsen's conviction, Gloucester police, searching a back garden for the body of a young girl, found evidence of another series of gruesome murders.
I had to explain that the bodies are in the garden because the house itself is full. There's no more room in the house for bodies.
He said, right, we're going to keep you in the cellar. And when we've finished with you, we're going to kill you and bury you under the paving stones of Gloucester.
This time the police had 2 killers, husband and wife, Fred and Rosemary West. a marriage of murderers.
The West were total stone-cold psychopaths and capable of almost any unspeakable act. Two people like that coming together in a marriage union is very, very unlikely, but it happened here.
Over a 30-year period, Fred and Rosemary West committed 12 murders in Gloucestershire. But their crimes came to light only after they were accused of abusing their older children.
The house at 25 Cromwell Street was visited and the children were taken into care.
The house itself was used for all sorts of purposes. It was used as, I suppose, a brothel of a sort. The children were routinely abused sexually. Psychologically, they were all but destroyed, I think, in what happened to them.
All 8 children refused to give evidence against their parents, and the case was dropped. But during the investigation, the children let slip a remarkable allegation.
Various things had been said by mother and father to the effect that they would end up under the patio like Heather or something similar.
Heather West, the teenage sister the children had said was under the patio, hadn't been seen for 7 years.
It was said she had left because of an argument. They, especially Frederick West, had said that the reasons for her going was because that she had gone off with some lesbian friend, and that was what the family wanted her to do, was to leave.
But it seemed unlikely that the Wests would have asked Heather to leave because she was a lesbian. Rose herself was bisexual and regularly advertised for lovers in contact magazines. The police were convinced they were dealing with a murder. They set about lifting the patio in search of Heather's body.
Frederick West returned home. It would have been obvious to him, looking out of his window, that we were not actually going to give up. And shortly after that, he admitted to killing Heather.
I heard the 3:15 news headlines, and they mentioned a man had been arrested in Gloucester. And straight away, I thought, this has got to be something to do with the Wests.
Caroline had first met the Wests long before this.
I was 16 and I was hitchhiking home, and a Ford Pop, little grey Ford Pop, pulled up with a man and woman in it, and they offered me a lift. And they said that they lived in Gloucester, and the names were Fred and Rosemary West.
The couple offered Caroline a job as a nanny to their 3 children. As only 2 years separated Caroline and Rosemary, they soon became friends. But Fred was a different matter.
I've decided I didn't really like Fred. He used to brag a lot, and he said that he'd, if I ever got into trouble, not to worry because he could perform abortions. And I don't know, that just rang alarm bells in my head a little bit. So I left there like in the middle of November. I got back into hitchhiking, stood in the same spot, and their car pulled up. Rose got out of the car and she was all smiling and, oh, Caroline, we missed you, how are you, and all that. And then Fred leaned across the car and looked out through the window and said, we've missed you and the kids have missed you. Would you like to come back? I didn't want to make a fuss. I got in the car. I got into the back. And he's looking in the mirror. And then he said, oh, have a feel, Rose, see if she's had sex. And I said, get off. And I said, I want to get out. Pull up, I want to get out. Fred pulled up on the side past this roundabout, and I thought he was pulling up to let me get out, but that's not what happened. He turned around in the car seat and started punching me around the side of the head. And I was still struggling with Rose, and before long I just blacked out. When I came round, he was tying my hands up behind my back, and then he put all tape round my head, and it went all the way round the head.
The petrified teenager was driven, bound and gagged, to Cromwell Street. There she was submitted to hours of torture.
They both started giving me like a genital examination. That's all I can describe it as. It was like a genital examination, and I was like crying. I was frightened. He took his belt off, and she held my legs, and he just kept beating me between the legs with the belt. They tied me to a chair at one point while they went downstairs, and they came back with a cup of tea, and they were like, it was like mental torture in a way, because you'd think you were safe one minute, and then something terrible would happen, which made you think you were in danger again, and then just as you got to the brink of thinking, oh, this is it, they're going to do something really awful to me, they changed back again to the nice couple with the cup of tea.
Serial killers may very well put their victim into a slightly different psychological category from the one that the person would ordinarily be in. In other words, they may strip down their full humanity and turn them into a vehicle for something or other. It doesn't mean that they dehumanize them. For many serial killers, their very humanity is what they need to see destroyed and crushed in front of them.
And it went on for about 4 hours. Actually, like sexual assault, cup of tea, sexual assault, cup of tea, something like that. 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a ring at the door, and Fred got up and went downstairs. And so I started trying to shout out, and Rose panicked and placed a pillow over my face and leaned on it. Fred came back in. Because it was the face I saw whipping the pillow off me, and he was so angry, and it's like looking at me, and his face in mine, snarling and saying, "You stupid bitch," things like that. "You shouldn't have done that. We're gonna have to kill you now."
Yet it was when Caroline was left alone with Fred that the chance of escape came.
Fred took his trousers back off and raped me. And I was like crying and saying, "Why can't you let me go? I won't tell anybody." He said, "You're here for Rosemary's pleasure." He said, "And I shouldn't have touched you. I shouldn't have done that. She's going to be really angry if she knows." And he said, "Don't. If you don't tell Rose what I've just done, and you promise you won't tell the police and you'll come back here, I'll let you go."
But Caroline did go to the police.
I think up until the rape charge was put to the Wests, they were denying everything. But once the rape charge was put to them, they decided that they would admit to the indecent assault and the bodily harm, but they wouldn't agree to the rape. And they said, "Oh, you'll have to go to court and you'll be cross-examined." And I am not going through this again. I can't handle this.
The rape charge was dropped, and the couple were fined £50 each for the sexual assault.
Now there was a total of £100 fine for what I went through for 12 hours. And I thought, well, that's what I'm worth. Worthless.
The early offence showed so many of the hallmarks that I find in sadistic psychosexual killers. but the very unusual element that there are two of them. It's a combination.
And over the next 22 years, this combination would torture and then kill 9 young girls, one of them their own daughter. Three days after beginning their search, the police found evidence that more than one murder had taken place at 25 Cromwell Street.
They showed me a bone which they dug up from this garden and said, what do you think of this, Doc? Usual thing. It's human, certainly, and it was female. And I remember looking down into this hole and scratching around finding more bones and looking up at Superintendent Bennett and saying, well, either she's got 3 legs or you've got another body.
West was due to appear before the magistrates' court at Gloucester. He mentioned to an officer who was taking him to the court that there was more human remains in the garden and that he had been the person who killed them.
The explanation was that the women, including his daughter, he'd got into arguments with of one sort or another, and in the argument they each separately had died on him, and he panicked, really didn't know what to do, was very concerned at upsetting his wife, and so he'd separately buried them in the garden. He knows he shouldn't have, but there you are.
Fred claimed the second victim was a former lodger at the house, Shirley Robinson, and that the third body buried in the garden was a friend of hers.
We knew by this time that Shirley Robinson was 6 months pregnant at the time that she met her death. And it was strongly put forward that the child that she was carrying was that of Frederick West, and further that Rosemary West knew that he was the father.
The third body was later identified as 16-year-old Alison Chambers. She'd lived in a care home just around the corner and had gone missing over a year after Shirley Robinson had disappeared.
It was not possible for her ever to have known or been a friend of Shirley Robinson. Whilst you had to listen and work on the information he was giving, you couldn't ever rely upon it.
I had a telephone call from the inquiry team explaining that they had a man in custody who they would like me to assist them to interview.
We needed to know, when did Frederick West first start committing the murders, and whether or not he was with Rosemary at the time.
What I saw is a lifetime, 2 lifetimes of sexual offending. What you're dealing with are grave, depraved murderers, and that there will be bodies almost everywhere that they're associated with. And my advice was, you have to take the house apart. You must take it apart, because that's where you'll find them.
Everything in 25 Cromwell Street, apart from being photographed and filmed, was removed. The walls were x-rayed, the floorboards were removed, and everything was looked upon very, very closely. Almost around the same time as this, the incident room was contacted by a member of the public.
The caller had information about a missing 19-year-old. Linda Goff, the daughter of a local fireman, had moved in with the Wests in 1973. Then she disappeared.
Mrs. Goff had visited number 25. Rosemary appeared to be wearing a cardigan that had been owned by Linda.
The police now had evidence to link Rosemary West to a missing person.
She is wearing clothing. She is saying things. She is supporting Frederick that Linda's left the address. And we know, of course, that that wasn't to be the case.
With the investigation now centering on his wife, Fred stopped answering questions and instead gave the police a written confession.
West's solicitor brought to me a note signed by Frederick West that admitted to a further approximate 9 killings.
He would not give up his wife. She was very important to him, so he wouldn't give her up.
But Fred's confession had not exonerated his wife. When Linda Goff's body was discovered under the downstairs bathroom, Rose West was also charged with her murder. And the police suspected there would be more charges to come.
We were trying to build a total history of everyone who had been in contact with the West for any reason whatsoever over the period of something like 25 years.
Police are still trying to contact members of Mr. West's large family and have appealed for his first wife, Catherine Costello, and daughter Charlene to get in touch with them.
Fred West had married Catherine or Rena Costello in 1962. She was already pregnant with someone else's child, Charmaine, who was born in March 1963. A year later, the couple had a daughter of their own.
Frederick West had met Rena in Scotland. They came back to Gloucestershire, and then Rena left.
Rena had left her daughters with Fred. When she came back looking for them, she disappeared. 23 years later, Fred confessed to killing his first wife.
He said that Rena was in a field at Kempley, in an area very much close to Muchmarcle, where Frederick West was born.
But Rena Costello's was not the only body buried in the fields at Kempley.
After the remains of Rena were discovered, he made mention then of having a feeling that there may be another victim in the field, but that he had not been involved in any way in her murder or killing. He felt that a former girlfriend of his, called Annie McFall, had somehow died very many years ago.
Fred had met the Glasgow teenager when he and Rena had moved to Scotland in the early 1960s. Annie had then followed the couple south to Gloucestershire.
We know that for a while she was living in Muchmarcle with Frederick West, and we believe that she may have become pregnant by Frederick West.
Annie had also disappeared.
The police had awful trouble in the fields, of course, because they had to shift thousands of tons of earth. There was a gigantic hole with bulldozers and whatever. And in fact, the body was found at the last minute, after 3 months, I think.
A 6-month-old fetus was found with the remains of Annie McFall. But Rose could not have been involved in this murder. It had taken place long before Fred had met her.
She had been a very giggly, lively, pretty young woman. She herself had been heartily abused by her father, who was a very violent-tempered man.
Rose quickly escaped this unhappy home life and moved in with Fred and his 2 children at a caravan park. He was 28, she was just 15.
Inseparable. The one always seemed to know instinctively what the other was doing, almost without thinking. They did everything together. They shared everything.
What happened is that they each fueled the other. They each legitimised what the other was doing. They were each able to share the pleasure that they got from what they did.
In June 1970, Fred and Rose moved into the ground floor flat at 25 Midland Road in Gloucester. With them were the 2 children from Fred's first marriage. But exactly 1 year later, Rose told neighbours that the oldest 8-year-old Charmaine had gone back to live with her mother. It was a lie. Charmaine was dead.
Frederick West said that Charmaine was at 25 Midland Road, underneath a cellar area.
While Fred West had obviously been involved in the disposal of the body, he had laid the foundations that had been her grave. It was unlikely he had killed his daughter. He was in jail at the time of her disappearance.
The evidence would support that Rosemary killed Charmaine when Frederick West was in prison. Every indication would be that she was probably the more dominant and more violent of the 2. She overtook Frederick West in her desires and her insatiable sexual appetite.
Essentially, it was a perfect union of 2 totally deviant, degenerate people.
And when this perfect union moved to 25 Cromwell Street, other young girls started disappearing. In November 1973, 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper disappeared while waiting for a bus in Worcester. A month later, 21-year-old Lucy Partington disappeared from a bus stop close to her home in Cheltenham.
When her disappearance was reported to the police, it was considered immediately, just like Carol Cooper, to be out of character and extremely sinister.
12 months later, 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard also disappeared at a bus stop. All 3 girls had been abducted and taken to 25 Cromwell Street. There they were tortured, murdered, then buried under the cellar floor.
I mean, much is made of the nursery, as I think it was called. It's a half cellar. It's the West's playground. So it was inevitable that their playground was where they kept these people. Of course, they liked to keep them close to them because it meant that they could put their children's beds over the graves, the pits where these poor young girls were. That was the arrangement that you had.
Of course, the bones are all jumbled up. They were buried in this sort of sticky mud. But generally speaking, they were dropped into a sort of a square sump about 2 feet by 2 feet. And the heads and legs had been taken off, probably to facilitate them being buried in a small space.
The body of a missing Swiss student, Therese Siegenthaler, and that of 18-year-old Juanita Mott, a former lodger at the house, were also recovered from the cellar floor.
The victims at Cromwell Street all had some form of bindings with them similar to the information that had been given by Caroline Raine when she had been assaulted.
And he was tying my hands up behind my back, and then he put all tape around my head.
It's important to remember that the key element in sadism and sexual sadism is hurting, terrifying, controlling, punishing the victim.
In total, 12 bodies had been recovered. Now the police had to find out if they belonged to the missing girls.
It is not legally necessary for a dentist to keep dental records once a person has, as it were, disappeared. In order to determine identity, without dental records. We were doing a superimposition of photographs on facial remains, because that enables me to work out the scale, the size of a person's face. Because you see, the teeth don't change, although their face might a bit.
As well as identifying all 12 victims, Professor Whitaker was able to prove Charmaine West had been killed while Fred was in prison.
I'd noticed when I was comparing the photograph of Charmaine with her skull that although there was a perfect match in terms of the shape and size of teeth and so on, there'd been very slight movement between the teeth that were visible in the photograph and the teeth in the skull. So I was then able to determine, by adding that on, it was a few months, so I took the time the photograph was taken, added on those months of growth, and that told me when she died.
Charmaine West had been murdered in June 1971 while her father was in jail. This left Rose West as her most likely murderer. But Fred was still refusing to implicate his wife in any of the deaths.
From the day of his arrest, he was endeavouring to protect Rosemary from any further investigation. He always said that she was shopping, she was visiting relatives, she was away from the address. That position continued until shortly before he went from Gloucester Police Station to Winson Green, where he started to mention that other persons may or would have been involved, and that this would all be revealed at some later stage.
But on New Year's Day 1995, Fred West was found dead in his cell.
I was asked what I thought the chances of Frederick West killing himself would be at a fairly early stage, and my view was that as long as he believes that his wife will support him, then he won't hurt himself. If he believes that his wife is repudiating him, then he'll kill himself. It's exactly what happened.
On their last 2 court appearances together, Rose had ignored her husband. And with Fred West's suicide, Britain's first serial killing marriage was finally ended.
This is a team. This is a husband and wife double act. It is a very difficult thing for people to contemplate.
Rose West was convicted of 10 counts of murder in November 1995 and sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge recommended that she never be released. Since then, she has remained adamant that she was not involved in any of the deaths at either Cromwell Street or Midland Road.
She's in total denial.
At least with Fred, you knew what you were getting, roughly you knew what you were getting. But Rose had been a friend. It's like having your mother turn around and do that to you. Then I had nightmares, but I felt like I redeemed myself by hoping to get Rose West convicted, and I put some ghosts to rest.
Looking at tomorrow night, the debate on the MMR jab continues as the government launches its latest campaign to restore confidence in the vaccine. That's tonight, with Trevor McDonald tomorrow at 7:30.